Why do we even have a middle class? Because most of history didn't have one. Now, most of us were probably taught in school that the middle class exists because of things like unions or specific government policies. But what really fueled its growth was something that many modern economists actually fear. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the US experienced what's known as the Great Deflation. And while we associate deflation with economic collapse today, the Great Deflation actually coincided with one of the most explosive periods of economic growth in all of history, the Industrial Revolution. With innovation ramping up production and efficiency on a scale never before seen, prices for pretty much everything fell drastically. And as goods became cheaper, people could afford more with their wages. Things that were once out of reach for everyone but the ultra-wealthy became available to millions. And families that used to barely get by as subsistence farmers could save and invest their money. To put it another way, at the start of the Great Deflation in 1870, more than half of America's population were subsistence farming. By 1900, that number had fallen to barely a third of the country's population. In its place, more and more Americans entered into what became known as the middle class. They moved to cities and began working in factories, not because they were forced to or because they had no other options. They did so because the pay was so much better. The prospect of so many people moving to cities and getting paid more than ever before, combined with rapidly falling prices for everything from clothing to food, meant that millions were lifted out of poverty in just a few decades. But if deflation gave birth to the middle class, why do so many economists fear it today? Well, a large part of the reason that we associate deflation with economic collapse is because of the Great Depression. And as a result, any sign of falling prices inevitably leads to demands that the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world begin printing money to make sure inflation gets back to at least 2%. But the Industrial Revolution shows us that deflation, through increased productivity as opposed to collapsing demand, is actually one of the best recipes for economic growth imaginable. Ultimately, the historical fear of deflation needs to be reevaluated. Yes, unchecked deflation in a struggling economy can lead to disaster, as it did during the Great Depression. But when deflation results from productivity and technological advancement, it's a very different scenario. This is how a society ultimately builds wealth, not by manipulating interest rates or the supply of money, but by building, producing, and innovating more effectively and efficiently. When we make more goods that people actually want, rather than simply printing money so politicians can spend it to get reelected, societies flourish.